Hi, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Shuchi, for that amazing introduction. Thank you to Brookline Booksmith and all the staff for hosting Jen and me. And thank you, Jen, for doing the event with me. So Jen and I have noticed some themes in our work, so we're going to try and talk about some of the similarities and then open up to discussion. So I'm going to do a short reading. Jen's going to do a short reading. We'll have a little discussion between us, and then we'll open up to Q&A at the end. So as you heard, I'm going to read from my first novel, which is called Everything I Never Told You. It takes place in 1977, and it follows the Lee family who live in small town Ohio, small college town. And the father, James Lee, is a Chinese American, and his wife, Marilyn, is a white woman, and they have 3 children. And at the very beginning of the book, their middle child, Lydia, has disappeared. She's not in her room in the morning. And we learn right away that she's dead. She's drowned in the local lake. Her family doesn't find this out for a little bit. And as the story progresses, the family has to sort of reckon with the secrets that are unveiled by, come and sit down. be comfortable. So the family has to sort of reckon with the secrets that are exposed by Lydia's death. So I'm going to read you 2 short sections. First, I'm going to read you a little section from the very, very beginning of the novel, just to give you sort of a taste of the style. This is the very beginning, so you don't really need to know anything yet. Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. 1977, May 3rd, 6:30 in the morning. No one knows anything but this innocuous fact. Lydia is late for breakfast. As always, next to her cereal bowl, her mother has placed a sharpened pencil and Lydia's physics homework. 6 problems flagged with small ticks. Driving to work, Lydia's father nudges the dial towards WXKP, Northwest Ohio's best news source, vexed by the crackles of static. On the stairs, Lydia's brother yawns, still twined in the tail end of his dream. And in her chair, in the corner of the kitchen, Lydia's sister hunches moon-eyed over her cornflakes, sucking them to pieces one by one, waiting for Lydia to appear. It's she who says, at last, Lydia's taking a long time today. Upstairs, Marilyn opens her daughter's door and sees the bed unslept in. Neat hospital corners still pleated beneath the comforter, pillows still fluffed and convex. Nothing seems out of place. Mustard-colored corduroys tangled on the floor, a single rainbow-striped sock. A row of science fair ribbons on the wall, a postcard of Einstein. Lydia's duffel bag crumpled on the floor of the closet. Lydia's green book bag slouched against her desk. Lydia's bottle of Baby Soft atop the dresser, a sweet, powdery, loved baby scent still in the air. But no Lydia. Marilyn closes her eyes. Maybe when she opens them, Lydia will be there, covers pulled over her head as usual, wisps of her hair trailing from beneath. A grumpy lump bundled under the bedspread that she'd somehow missed before. I was in the bathroom, Mom. I went downstairs for some water. I was lying right here all the time. Of course, when she looks, nothing has changed. The closed curtains glow like a blank television screen. Downstairs, she stops in the doorway of the kitchen, a hand on each side of the frame. Her silence says everything. I'll check outside, she says at last, maybe for some reason. She keeps her gaze trained on the floor as she heads for the front door, as if Lydia's footprints might be crushed into the hall runner. Nath says to Hannah, she was in her room last night. I heard her radio playing at 11:30. He stops, remembering that he had not said goodnight. Can you be kidnapped if you're 16? Hannah asks. Nath prods at his bowl with a spoon. Cornflakes wilt and sink into clouded milk. Their mother steps back into the kitchen, and for one glorious fraction of a second, Nath sighs with relief. There she is, Lydia, safe and sound. It happens sometimes. Their faces are so alike you'd see one in the corner of your eye and mistake her for the other. The same elfish chin and high cheekbones and left cheek dimple. The same thin-shouldered build. Only the hair color is different. Lydia's ink black instead of their mother's honey blonde. He and Hannah take after their father. Once a woman stopped the 2 of them in the grocery store and asked, Chinese? And when they'd said yes, not wanting to get into halves and wholes, she'd nodded sagely. I knew it, she said, by the eyes. She'd tugged the corner of each eye outward with a fingertip. But Lydia, defying genetics, somehow has her mother's blue eyes, and they know this is one more reason she is their mother's favorite, and their father's too. Then Lydia raises one hand to her brow and becomes his mother again. The car's still here, she says, but Nath had known it would be. Lydia can't drive. She doesn't even have a learner's permit yet. Last week she'd surprised them all by failing the exam, and their father wouldn't even let her sit in the driver's seat without it. Nath throws his cereal, which has turned to sludge at the bottom of his bowl. The clock in the front hall ticks, then strikes 7:30. No one moves. "Are we still going to school today?" Hannah asks. Marilyn hesitates. Then she goes to her purse and takes out her keychain with a show of efficiency. "You've both missed the bus. Nath, take my car and drop Hannah off on your way. Then, don't worry, we'll find out what's going on." She doesn't look at either of them. Neither looks at her. When the children have gone, she takes a mug from the cupboard, trying to keep her hands still. Long ago, when Lydia was a baby, Marilyn had once left her in the living room, playing on a quilt, and went into the kitchen for a cup of tea. She'd been only 11 months old. Marilyn took the kettle off the stove and turned around to find Lydia standing in the doorway. She'd started and set her hand down on the hot burner. A red spiral welt rose on her palm, and she touched it to her lips and looked at her daughter through watering eyes. Standing there, Lydia was strangely alert, as if she were taking in the kitchen for the first time. Marilyn didn't think about missing those first steps, or how grown up her daughter had become. The thought that flashed through her mind wasn't, "How did I miss it?" but, "What else have you been hiding?" Nath had pulled up and wobbled and tipped over and toddled right in front of her, but she didn't even remember Lydia beginning to stand. She seemed so steady on her bare feet, tiny fingers just peeking from the ruffled sleeve of her romper. Marilyn often had her back turned, opening the refrigerator or turning over the laundry. Lydia could have been walking weeks ago, while she was bent over a pot, and she would not have known. She had scooped Lydia up and smoothed her hair and told her how clever she was, how proud her father would be when he came home. But she felt as if she'd found a locked door in a familiar room. Lydia, still small enough to cradle, had secrets. Marilyn might feed her and bathe her and coax her legs into pajama pants, but already parts of her life were curtained off. She kissed Lydia's cheek and pulled her close, trying to warm herself against her daughter's small body. Now Marilyn sips tea and remembers that surprise. So as you know already from the first one, the story doesn't end well. They find out fairly soon that Lydia has died. Because Jen also is really interested in writing about women and their relationships with their mothers, and also education is, her anthology has to do with Latina women and their experiences in higher ed. I want to read you one other short section that involves Marilyn and her mother. So this is the mother in the story and her own mother. And it takes place in the 50s. And as you'll see, they have a somewhat complicated relationship as well. In her first year at Radcliffe, 1955, Marilyn had enrolled in introductory physics, and her advisor glanced at her course schedule and paused. He was a plump man with a tweed suit and a crimson bow tie, a dark gray hat brimmed down on the table beside him. "Why do you want to take physics?" he asked, and she explained shyly that she was hoping to become a doctor. "Not a nurse?" he'd said, with a chuckle. From a folder he pulled her high school transcript and studied it. "Well," he said, "I see you received very good grades in your high school physics course." She'd had the highest grade in her class, had set the curve on every test. She'd loved physics, but he couldn't know that. On the transcript it said only A. She held her breath, waiting, afraid he would tell her that science was too hard, that she'd better try something like English or history instead. In her mind she prepared her retort. Instead he said, "All right then, why don't you try chemistry, if you think you can handle it," and signed her course slip and handed it over, just like that. When she arrived at the laboratory, though, she found herself the only girl in a room of 15 men. The instructor tut-tutted and said, "Miss Walker, you'd better tie up those golden locks." "Can I light the burner for you?" someone else would say. "Let me open that jar for you." When she broke a beaker the second day of class, 3 men rushed to her side. "Careful," they said, "better let us help." Everything, she soon realized, started with better. "Better let me pour that acid for you. Better stand back, this will make a pop." By the 3rd day of class, she decided to show them. She said no thank you when people offered to make her pipettes, then hid a grin as they watched her melt glass tubes over the Bunsen burner and stretch them like taffy into perfectly tapered droppers. While her classmates sometimes splashed their lab coats, burning holes all the way down to their suits, she measured acids with steady hands. Her solutions never bubbled onto the counter. Her results were the most accurate, her lab reports the most complete. By midterm, she set the curve for every exam, and the instructor had stopped smirking. She had always liked surprising people that way. In high school, she had approached her principal with a request to take shop instead of home ec. It was 1952, and in Boston, researchers were just beginning to develop a pill that would change women's lives forever. But girls still wore skirts to school, and in Virginia, her request had been radical. Home economics was required for every sophomore girl, and Marilyn's mother, Doris Walker, was the only home ec teacher at Patrick Henry Senior High. Marilyn had asked to switch into shop with the sophomore boys. It was the same class period, she pointed out. Her schedule wouldn't be disrupted. Mr. Tolliver, the principal, knew her well. She had been at the top of her class, girls and boys, since the 6th grade, and her mother had taught at the school for years. So he nodded and smiled as she made her case. Then he shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "We can't make an exception for anyone, or everyone will expect it." At the look on Marilyn's face, he reached across the desk and patted her hand. "Some of the equipment in the shop would be difficult for you to use," he told her. "And to be honest, Miss Walker, having a girl like you in the classroom would be very distracting to the boys in the class." He meant it as a compliment, she knew. She also knew that it wasn't. She smiled and thanked him for his time. It wasn't a true smile, and her dimples didn't show. So she had slouched in the back row of the home ec classroom, waiting out the first day welcome speech her mother had given for a dozen years, drumming her fingers as her mother promised to teach them everything a young lady needed to keep a house. As if, Marilyn thought, it might run away when you weren't looking. She studied the other girls in her class, noting who bit her nails, whose sweater was pilled, who smelled faintly of a cigarette snuck over lunch. Across the hall, she could see Mr. Landis, the shop teacher, demonstrating the correct way to hold a hammer. Keeping house, she had thought. Each day, she watched her classmates' clumsy, thimbled fingers, sucking the ends of threads, squinting for the needle's eye. She thought of her mother's insistence on changing clothes before dinner, though there was no longer a husband to impress with her fresh face and crisp house dress. It was after her father left that her mother had begun to teach. Marilyn had been 3. Her clearest memory of her father was a feel and a smell, the bristle of his cheek against hers as he lifted her up, and the tingle of Old Spice in her nostrils. She didn't remember his leaving, but knew it had happened. Everyone did. And now everyone had more or less forgotten it. Newcomers to the school district assumed Mrs. Walker was a widow. Her mother herself never mentioned it. She still powdered her nose after cooking and before eating. She still put on lipstick before coming downstairs to make breakfast. So they called it keeping house for a reason, Marilyn thought. Sometimes it did run away. And in English class, on a test, she wrote, "Irony, a contradictory outcome of events as if in mockery of the promise and fitness of things," and received an A. She began tangling the thread on her sewing machine. She snipped patterns without unfolding them, making paper-cut lace of the layers beneath. Her zippers ripped out of their dresses. She stirred eggshell fragments into the pancake batter. She switched salt and sugar in the sponge cake. One day she left her iron face down on the board, causing not only a blackened burn in the cover, but enough smoke to set off the fire sprinklers. That evening, at dinner, her mother finished her last bite of potato and set her knife and fork down, crossed neatly, on the plate. "I know what you're trying to prove," she said, "but believe me, I will fail you if you keep this up." Then she gathered the dishes and carried them to the sink. Marilyn did not move to help as she usually did. She watched her mother tie a ruffled apron around her waist, fingers knotting the strings in one quick motion. After the last dish was washed, her mother rinsed her hands and applied a dab of lotion from the bottle on the counter. Then she came to the table, brushed Marilyn's hair from her face, and kissed her forehead. Her hands smelled like lemons. Her lips were dry and warm. For the rest of her life, this is what Marilyn thought of first when she thought of her mother. Her mother, who had never left her hometown 80 miles from Charlottesville, who always wore gloves outside the house, and who never, in all the years Marilyn could remember, sent her to school without a hot breakfast. Who never mentioned Marilyn's father after he left, but raised her alone. Who, when Marilyn earned a scholarship to Radcliffe, hugged her for a long time and whispered, "How proud I am of you. You have no idea." And then, when she loosened her arms, looked into Marilyn's face and tucked her hair behind her ears and said, "You know, you'll meet a lot of wonderful Harvard men." I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was so beautiful. Thank you. So, hello everybody. It's wonderful to see you. I am the editor of a book called Wise Latinas, Writers on Higher Education. And I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background on the story of the book. But before that, I have to say a huge thank you to Christina, who is in the audience. She's one of my former students, and she is filling my heart right now. So when she walked in, I was like, truly this book is for you. You know, it's for my students and my Latina students who I feel like really inspire me as a teacher and as a writer. This is the book that I needed in college. Hi, Mom. Nice timing. This is the book that I needed in college because when I left for Connecticut College, a small liberal arts school, not too far away in distance, but certainly very far away in other manners. It felt a little bit of like time travel. There were high moments and there were low moments, and this is a book that I could have really relied on, voices, like a group of older sisters to guide me. And the story of the book is actually, this book took 10 years to make. I sent out a call for submissions, and I had collected essays from other Latina writers around the country that I had met at Breadloaf and Macondo and Vona, the writing workshop that you mentioned. And there was great interest, but when I brought the manuscript to a publisher in New York, they were sort of interested at the beginning, but then when I got there, they just had this question that kept resurfacing. Why Latinas? What's the big deal? What's so different about going to college as a Latina? What's the difference? So I realized that I had a lot of work to do in terms of turning up the dial on the rationale for the book and making that something that others could understand. And I worked on the book proposal at Grub Street, a creative writing center that I'm obsessed with. And I developed the project over time. Eventually, it is an editor at University of Nebraska Press who herself is Latina, who never questioned the rationale, who never questioned the purpose for the book. And I do think that there's a connection there, that she didn't have to ask those questions. So I'll just sort of stop there and briefly mention that college for me was a very complex time. I know that it is that case for many Latinas and many people, many women, many men. Sandra Cisneros has an essay in here called Only Daughter, and she writes that after 4 years in college and 2 more in graduate school and still no husband, my father shakes his head even now and says, I wasted all that education. So you can imagine, I mean, she's this phenomenal, accomplished writer, and her father's question is, but are you married? So these are some themes that resonate in here. There are stories by Latinas who study abroad and learn Spanish for the first time. First-generation college students, third-generation college students, international Latinas who come to the United States to study. There are stories by Latinas who come out of the closet in college. There are stories by Latinas who are professors in college and feel still like an anomaly. They feel alienated. Ruth Bahar has an essay in here where she talks about becoming a chair and having to call home and explain that to her parents and saying, una silla, and they're so confused, like, you're a chair? We don't understand. And, her father's like, are you going to get paid more? And she's like, not really. So there are, moments that I hope are funny, too, and entertaining. In my introduction, I write a lot about my mother and a story of a dress that was for my graduation day, which she saw as important as my wedding gown. But tonight I'm going to read just a scene or a section from a longer work that I've been developing, and it's about my very first time at college, at Connecticut College. So I hope you will humor me. I haven't read this out loud to a crowd yet, so Brookline, be nice to me. Okay. The only thing you'll need to know is that the girl named Abby, she is someone that I meet at the very beginning of school and who ends up becoming a good friend. Sit on that bed if you're a virgin. Abby pointed to the bed with the purple comforter. About 6 or 7 of us freshman girls filled the 300 square foot space on the top floor of Jane Addams' dormitory. The room, 2 twin beds on opposite sides propped up on cinder blocks, a long-necked desk lamp with a maroon scarf draped over it, and a white mini refrigerator full of Bud Light cans and a chipwich I'd taken from the dining hall earlier that evening. I waited for someone to laugh at Abby's instruction. Instead, girls played with the loose threads of their socks or reapplied lip gloss. Abby was the tallest one in the group, a confident brunette that looked much too sophisticated to be at this small liberal arts school in Connecticut. She'd been to France as a 7-year-old and spent a semester of her senior year in high school living in the Dominican Republic. Her Spanish was better than mine. I wouldn't learn that she grew up on a peach farm in western Massachusetts and that they only had 1 television in the whole house per choice until mid-semester. She wasn't a virgin. "Come on," Abby practically ordered. She circled her dorm key card and ID like she was a county sheriff. Maybe this was her idea of a friendly icebreaker for us girls who came mostly from New England states, not counting the redhead from Bulgaria. A petite blonde with a bob who had attended Choate boarding school, along with Donald Trump's daughter, disentangled herself from the web of 18-year-olds and took the 5 necessary steps to cross the room to sit on the non-virgin bed. Quiet plugged the room. Then another blonde wearing jean overalls and a flower-printed fitted t-shirt sat on the corner of the virgin mattress. Like that, each girl chose her bed. I sat on the one for virgins and let my naked feet dangle over the floor. Catholic, they probably assumed. Prude, I wanted to correct them. I sat and listened to what I knew I'd wanted to wait for until my wedding night, stories of losing their virginity. My mother said that only Americanas with loose morals slept around. She said this despite the fact that her own mother, both her sisters and niece, each became pregnant before their 19th birthdays and inadvertently their wedding nights. An early autumnal chill had gathered on the green hill of our campus. Girls returned to their flannel pajamas awaiting them in their dorm rooms. Those of us who remained sat on the rug and someone used a Swiss Army knife to cut the chipwich into fourths. I went to bed that night staring at my poster by Sark, How to Be an Artist, shimmering in the moonlight coming through the curtainless windows. Swing high on a swing set, sing out loud, laugh every day. All of these could be describing what love was. Maybe, I didn't know, but from what the experienced girls shared tonight, they didn't seem to have a clue either. I wasn't shy. In July, the Student Life office sent me a package full of pastel-colored brochures. Camping orientation trip, it read. Laptops at a discounted rate, Ethernet cables included, it read. An optional freshman cohort, freshman focus. A note-taking seminar during the first week of classes, Blaustein Building, 2nd floor. I signed up for all, minus the laptop deal. The price tag was about what my father made in a month after taxes. The camping orientation trip, I mailed in a money order for $300, which was half the price tag, and I wrote a little note. This is what I can afford. Thank you. They didn't bat an administrative eyelash because next thing I knew, I was rock climbing and doing trust falls with a bunch of white kids who had gone to prep schools and told me that I looked Indian with my hair like that and asked if I was going to be living in a special international dorm. But before all that, my mother, 12-year-old sister at the time, and I packed our family's blue minivan with boxes and Tupperware containers holding hair elastics, sponges that expand 10 times their size in water, dental floss, batteries, fig Newtons, and headed down to the campus where I would meet the other freshmen for the camping orientation trip. Basically, my mother had spent the early morning emptying the house drawers, and yes, the more stuff she packed, the easier the emotional amputation would be on both of us. I'll only be an hour-and-a-half drive away, I said to deaf ears. 3 years earlier, when my older sister Karen became the first in the family to go to college, my mother cried all weekend like someone had died. My father drove my sister all the way from our house in Framingham to her college dorm in Dallas, Texas. Ironically, for my parents, even a 3,000-mile move was little compared to their own experiences. They had drifted from their dusty, crowded childhood homes in Guatemala to Los Angeles in the 70s, with no more than 10 English words in their pockets and 2 entire families counting on them to send money home. The van chugged its way down the interstate. My dad couldn't get the day off work. The closer my mom steered toward my country club-like college and home for the next 4 years, the more I realized I was being dropped off into another life. 1 year's tuition plus room and board was $32,000. My dad didn't make that in a year. "Whoa," my sister said as we pulled up the dramatic, winding entrance. Chipper members of the Student Government Association greeted us. 2 girls bearing midriffs painted with the numbers 01 in blue and white waved white poster board signs like the car wash girls on Route 9 in Natick. They smiled and directed us to the right dorm. We parked. We lugged boxes and SnackWells and plants and enough pair of socks for the entire floor, all the way up 4 flights. After we chose the good side of the room, my roommate wasn't arriving for another week, having opted not to partake in the freshman camping orientation trip. We prolonged our goodbyes by standing outside the campus center and staring at other freshmen and their parents, none of whom looked like us. "What's a grinder?" my sister asked. She pointed to the grinders for sale sign gripping onto the plastic fold-out table with duct tape. I was too busy trying to find a way to talk to the 2 brown curly-haired girls chatting in front of me. When I finally asked where they were from and they answered Sudbury, and I said, "Oh, I'm from Framingham," they offered half smiles and returned to their conversation. When it was time to board the bus, my mother cried softly and rubbed my back like I was seasick, and kissed my cheek and handed me a Hallmark card and asked if I was hungry because she did have a Snickers in her purse, and she hugged me 17 more times before a final wave of her hand. I was off. I slouched in the front seat of the bus by myself. Behind me, I listened to a heavy-set girl who looked like she could be in her 40s and a lanky boy with wire-rimmed glasses as they shared definitions of a successful life. "I want to run a business out of my home so I don't have to pay for childcare, and I want it all. Trips to Italy, a garden." I sank lower in my seat. Bits of conversations fell into my lap over the 3-hour bus ride to rural New York, something I thought was an oxymoron. Well, I'd never been to the city. Well, yes, Queens. My head hurt. I fell asleep. I woke up to lush green life everywhere, save for our yellow school bus and the bright red North Face gear everyone but me seemed to own. We all walked to a large open field. If I died here, my parents wouldn't have a clue where to find me. The counselors made us stand in a big circle. "We'd better not have to hold hands," I prayed under my breath, aware that I had positioned myself between anorexia nervosa on one side and a boy with a blonde goatee on the other. "We're going to sit on each other," announced the female counselor. "Turn, put your hands on your partner's shoulders, and sit." Like robots, my new classmates obeyed. I was too short to reach the boy's bony shoulders in front of me. I didn't want to touch anyone. But there I was, sitting on a stranger and staring at the back of a faded Fish concert t-shirt somewhere in the northeast woods at the end of summer. Somehow, miraculously, I didn't fall. Thanks.
One of the themes from Jen's essay and then from those in her anthology are women feeling sort of like they need to sort of prove themselves, that they're not imposters, and sort of prove to themselves or to other people that they belong there in college. And so I was sort of curious about what drew Jen herself to that theme, and if she noticed any of those sort of similarities in the essays.
That's a great question. Thanks. There actually is an essay in here by Beatriz Terrazas, and it's called Poser. And she writes about her time being a journalism fellow at Harvard. She grew up in Texas, and when she was at Harvard, she would often feel like a poser. Like, I don't really deserve to be here. Somebody's going to find me out. They're going to say, like, oh, your application, that was a mistake. And here she is, a Neiman Fellow, right? And she went on to win all these awards for her journalism. So there's actually a psychological, term, I guess. There's a real area of study in psychology that has to do with this feeling like a poser. And it happens a lot, I think, to women of color, first-generation students, and that certainly is a big theme in the book. I think a lot of the women reflect on that, but then they also find ways to, I guess, battle that. And one of the ways they do that is by just sharing their stories and finding this kind of, community among their friends and saying, oh yeah, I feel like that too. And then they go back and then that's the way. I don't know, like Christine is in the audience, she could probably tell us more too.
So I guess in response, I've been going around and doing a couple of readings, and I've been really touched by the number of people who come up to me. They're usually Asian Americans, but actually not always, who say, I feel like you were able to encapsulate something that I felt about sort of feeling uncomfortable. At one of the readings that I did, somebody asked me, how did you research the racism? And I didn't actually know how to respond to that question at first. And I said, the sad thing is that a lot of the incidents in the book, whether they're sort of big incidents or very just small incidents of people feeling uncomfortable, were all things that had happened to me or to family or friends. And I think it's that feeling of being a little bit on the outside that is sort of common. Whether it's because of your race or because of your social class, I feel like that sort of feeling is something that a lot of people end up experiencing.
Yeah. Definitely. And I was thinking, I read Celeste's book before it came out, and we had a book club at Grub Street, and I mean, Adam, my husband in the audience, you can ask him, I just was turning the pages, I could not stop reading it. But it's also something that I wanted to ask you about, writer to writer, just kind of this idea, because we write a lot about our mothers, and whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, they are sometimes in the audience, and they are sometimes, whether we admit it or not, or like it or not, in the room when we're composing or writing. So I just wondered what your experience has been like with your mom. After, I assume she's read the novel, and just what her reaction has been.
So I actually am not sure if my mother has read the book yet. So I wouldn't give it to her until I had sort of the finished version of the book, because I wanted to give her sort of the real book. And then almost immediately after I sent it to her, I think I sent it to her on a Thursday, and then she came to visit me the following Monday. And I had told her, you are not allowed to read the book while you're visiting me, because I couldn't think of any worse torture than your own mother sitting in your living room reading the book that you had written in front of your face. So I told her she couldn't read it. So she came and she said, well, I read the first 8 pages, and I really liked those so far, and I have to go home and read the rest of it. So I actually don't know if she has read it yet. But my mom is not the mom in this book. I was fortunate that my mother was actually really supportive of sort of me doing what I wanted, and the mother in this book has particular expectations for her daughter that lead to a lot of pressure. But I did kind of take little bits of my mom's life. My mom is a scientist herself, and the mother in the book really wants to go into the sciences and isn't able to do that. And I saw sort of my mother being a chemist, which is a really heavily male-dominated field, being the only woman in her department, being the chair in the department, and having the men kind of test her power, whether they meant to or not. I saw sort of what it was like for her to be a woman in the sciences, and I tried to work some of that into the book. And I think that as she's seen that, she's starting to notice some of those similarities and see where I pulled some of that from. I did write an essay about my mother and her cookbook, which was published in the live section of the New York Times, and I learned that if you write about your mother and then the newspaper calls to fact check and has to ask your mother whether everything that you said about her is true, it's kind of awkward. But she handled it really well, so I think she was actually kind of proud.
Of course, yeah, she should be. I don't know if anyone has questions for us about the writing life for our books, anything.
Or about our moms.
You said this was your first novel. How much other stuff did you publish in various places, the internet, in journals before it?
Okay, so the question is, since this is my first novel, what was all the other stuff that I sort of did before that? So the answer is that I published a bunch of stuff. So this novel took 6 years to write, but before that I had been writing stories. I published short stories in literary magazines and journals, some of them online. I published a couple of essays. I published, I guess if you count online stuff, I used to work as the blog editor for a writing website, and so I was sort of responsible for writing all the blog posts. And so I was writing the equivalent basically of 3 essays every week, just about what was going on in the writing world, or things that I read that were interesting, or topics that were sort of interesting to writers. So the answer is that I wrote a lot. The flip side of that question is, what did I write that didn't get published before this novel? And that's also a lot. I wrote, this morning I was talking to a really great group of teen writers at Grub Street, the writing center where Jen and I both teach, and telling them sort of what my path to being a writer was. And I told them that when I was about 15, I had written 2 novels, which were about 100 pages each. I mean, those are in a drawer, those are, I don't ever want to see them again. A lot of things like that. And I think all of that writing, whether it gets published or not, sort of all feeds into the project that that you end up publishing eventually. That it's all sort of practice. It's like playing the piano, you practice it and you learn new skills. Other questions? Yes. In the back. Latecomer.
Sorry. I was struck by the phenomenon of Celeste reading, in which is described how women were expected, or actually Jen was describing it too, how women were expected to go to college at that time with the sole expectation or main expectation of finding a husband, which I remember my mother has described a lot in her own college experiences. And I was wondering, Jen, how much did you see that as a theme among the essayists whose works you were selecting, and how much did they speak to that? And how much of that do you think had to do with a Latina, how did that intersect with the Latina experience for those women as well?
Yeah, well, that's a great, meaty question. Definitely that's another theme throughout. It's interesting because a lot of women write about their mothers. This could have been an anthology of mother-daughter essays. I think education kind of brings that out. Leaving home, traditionally, and this is very traditional, not everyone, but traditionally Latinas don't leave home until they're married. That's when you leave the home. And so for a lot of the women here, they were trailblazing. They were really breaking that tradition in their larger extended families. For me, that was not the case. I think I was always encouraged to go to college. If anything, I think my parents were afraid that a boy would get in the way of school and homework, and I was never allowed to talk to boys on the phone or anything like that, anything normal. And there is definitely this theme of, I think there's an element of having to take care of your family. There's this kind of pressure and responsibility, but also a beautiful obligation to take care of your parents and your family. And if you leave and don't come back, or you leave for the wrong reasons, then you're not really fulfilling that. So there's that kind of stress. I think a lot of Latinas face stress because they go away to college and they're doing their homework and doing their assignments and trying to do well, but then they come home and somebody needs something translated, or they need to pick someone up at the airport, or they need to take someone to the doctor, and it's this kind of family obligation that is very unique, I think, to our cultural group, although not exclusive, I guess. Any other questions? There's wine back there.
I have a question. It's interesting because you go from writer to editor with this anthology. So how was that transition for you? And also, I'm curious if there were essays that you couldn't include, or was that very painful for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think editing, there's a slightly different hat. There were essays that I did want to include, and it was kind of hard to, quote unquote, turn them down, especially when they were by writers that I really admired. And but I didn't want every essay in here to strike the same note. It felt like in music, if you just have the same note, there would be no rhythm. So I wanted a community college story, first generation story. There's someone, Lorraine Lopez writes about having a stalker in college. There's a woman who gets pregnant in college. There was a beautiful essay in the Daily Beast written by an undocumented Latina who goes to Harvard, and she published it under anonymous in the Daily Beast. And I asked for the right to reprint that? And they said, sure. And I was so happy to have that voice in here. But then they asked for $500 or something crazy, and I had, no, I couldn't do that. So that was a hard choice. But, you know, someone recently asked me, if you edit this or edit another edition of this in 2024, how might the experience be different for Latinas entering college, or what do you hope to be different? And other than having Sonia Sotomayor write the foreword for that one, you know, I hope that there are more stories of success and kind of these celebrations.
We'll be up here to sign books if you would like to sign books or ask us questions privately. And there's also wine and cookies in the back, so please help yourselves. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.